There is one vital role in the worship team which, if performed correctly, goes completely unnoticed. That role, of course, is the role of the sound man. If you are a sound man who is trying to figure out how to best serve the worship team, or a worship leader who is trying to speak their language, we're going to walk through some super helpful tips in today's Weekly Worship Thoughts. The fundamental frequencies for each instrument are incredibly important to know and to understand. That knowledge will serve you well as you aim to craft a clear and compelling mix of the instruments on stage. So go ahead and go back through the Focus Track series and learn about the fundamental frequencies of each instrument. Then be sure to put that knowledge to good use. There are always important harmonic frequencies above each fundamental frequencies for all of the instruments. Now, some of those frequencies are pleasant and some are harsh. Typically, the most effective way to craft your mix is by making sure that the fundamental frequencies are present, aggressively cutting the harsh frequencies out, and slightly accentuating the pleasant harmonic frequencies. You always want to begin crafting your mix by setting a proper gain structure. The soundboard has a lot of volume knobs. The gain or trim knob is a volume knob. Each EQ knob is essentially an independent volume knob. The channel fader affects the volume, as does the master fader, obviously. Now, there are many ways to get the volume that you are looking for, but what is the best way? Well, just be sure to set your gain structure intelligently. Now, there are two basic ideas for how to set proper gain structure. The one idea is to set the channel fader to unity or 0 dB and then adjust the gain or the trim knob on that channel until the output level is loud but not clipping. Since the channel fader is optimized to work from unity, this can be an effective method. Personally, I prefer a different approach. I like to adjust my gain or my trim knob until the input is hitting about 60% of what is available, and then allow the channel fader to just go wherever it needs to once I'm actually crafting the mix. In this way, I set the gain of every channel before I even begin to craft my mix. Now, since the gain or the trim usually affects the monitor or the aux send for the musicians, this method allows me to set it and forget it when it comes to the gain or the trim knob, and then I can just focus on running the faders. Sound men, don't overthink your job. Honestly, at the end of the day, your job is to be a glorified volume adjuster, and that's it. So don't overthink it. Sure, there's a ton that can go into it, and as soundmen, we should strive to continue to learn about EQ and how to properly set compression or gates and run the effects and more, but don't forget to focus on the basics. Just make sure that nothing is too loud and that the lead vocals are coming through strong, and you'll be fine. Pay attention to the pots and the pans. There is much more to the soundboard than just the channel faders. Each gain or trim and EQ pot is important. Each panning decision matters. On the one hand, I like to say don't touch it unless you know what your adjustment is going to do and how it will affect the mix. On the other hand, you'll never really learn unless you have the freedom to just mess with it and find out what happens. So this is what I would suggest. Use a portion of each worship team practice or rehearsal to play with stuff, but don't play with anything during the actual service. During the service, only do what you know needs to be done. Never set the EQ for an instrument in solo mode. Probably the number one mistake that I see soundmen make is to solo each channel in order to set its EQ. Don't. Just stop. That doesn't work. The solo button is for finding and fixing problems, not for generally setting EQ. If you set the EQ for each instrument perfectly in solo mode, making each instrument sound awesome on its own, I promise you that you will have a terrible full mix. When it comes to mixing a band, it doesn't matter how an instrument sounds on its own. It only really matters how it sounds in the mix. Plus, the open mics on stage will always need to be factored in. Additive versus subtractive EQ. Some soundmen achieve their desired EQ by adding low, mid, or high frequencies to the channel. Others achieve their desired EQ by taking frequencies away. So which is better? Well, it depends. I think you are always further ahead by subtracting offending frequencies rather than adding the desired ones. But there are many ways to achieve the same goal. Scientifically speaking, you do not have more of a specific frequency than what you have available to you at unity or at detent. Therefore, by adding more, you are adding something that doesn't actually exist. Now, I would personally rather take something away that does exist than add something that doesn't exist. Artistically speaking, however, that additional frequency, volume that doesn't actually exist, sure does sound cool. Now, as a side note, you will experience much less feedback by cutting rather than boosting EQ. So that's a bonus. Scientific versus artistic mixing. Mixing music is both a science and an art. The best soundmen learn how to use both. Now, I have met soundmen who know the science flawlessly, but their mix sounds terrible. I have also met soundmen who are super artistic, but their lack of basic EQ knowledge and application make for a harsh, hurtful mix. Learn the science and the numbers, but be sure to create something that is musical and not just mathematic. Use the tools of the trade. For musicians, it's a metronome. For soundmen, it's a decibel reader. Get one, use it. Work with the worship leader or lead pastor to figure out the desired volume level for your space and your worship service context, and make sure that you stay within those parameters for each service. If people complain that it's too loud or too quiet, but the decibel reader says you're right where you want to be, then simply thank them for their input while knowing in your heart of hearts that you have been a good and faithful servant. Now, there is much more that could be said about the role of the soundman, but I need to at least make this one last point, and it's really important. Don't forget that you are working primarily with humans. So much of the role of the soundman is technological, and it can become far too easy to treat the humans that you work with, like the worship leader, the musicians, the congregation, etc., the same way that you treat technology. Don't do that. Smile, care, be a good human. Perhaps your positive attitude and personality, or sometimes lack thereof, are being noticed far more than you realize. If you are a sound man, what was one interesting truth or idea that stood out to you about your role in the worship team, and how do you think that truth or idea will help you in the future? If you are not a sound man, what did you learn about how to effectively communicate with the sound men in your worship team? Do you think the sound man should be considered a vital part of the worship team, or should their role be considered as separate from the worship team? Why do you feel this way? If you see the role of the sound man as being a vital part of the worship team, what are some practical ways to reinforce that idea in your specific context? Given the information you just received, what do you think is the number one thing the soundmen in your specific worship team context should work on in order to improve the overall quality of the worship team as a whole?